January 1944. A cold Atlantic wind swept across the deck as another transport ship edged toward the American coastline. Packed below were hundreds of German prisoners of war, soldiers captured in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. Many had spent weeks crossing an ocean now dominated by Allied naval power. Their uniforms were worn, their boots carried the dust of distant battlefields, and their understanding of America came almost entirely from Nazi propaganda. They had been told the United States was soft. A nation obsessed with comfort. A country lacking the discipline to fight a long war. But as the morning fog slowly lifted, the first thing they saw was not a skyline. It was movement. Freighters lined the harbor in every direction. Giant cranes swung through the air without pause, lifting tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and crates of supplies onto waiting railcars. Long columns of locomotives disappeared toward the horizon while fresh cargo ships waited their turn at the docks. Smoke rose from distant factories that never seemed to stop working. For many of these prisoners, this was their first glimpse of the industrial machine fueling the Allied war effort. And before they had even reached their prison camps, an uncomfortable thought had already begun to take shape. If this was only one American port, how many more were there? That question would follow thousands of German prisoners throughout their captivity. Over the next months, many would travel across the United States by train, passing endless cities, farms, steel mills, aircraft factories, highways, and rail networks unlike anything they had imagined. What they witnessed challenged years of propaganda and forced many to confront a reality that few had considered while fighting in Europe. For some, the realization came slowly. For others, it arrived in an instant. Germany had built one of the most formidable armies in history. Its soldiers had conquered much of Europe with speed and precision. But wars are not won by armies alone. Behind every rifle stood a factory. Behind every tank stood thousands of workers. Behind every battlefield victory stood an economy capable of replacing every loss. And as America revealed the true scale of that economy, many German prisoners reached the same conclusion. This was an opponent whose strength stretched far beyond the battlefield. They had not simply been captured by another army. They had entered the world's greatest industrial power. And that realization would change the way many of them understood the war itself. By the beginning of 1943, the balance of the Second World War had begun to shift in ways that many German soldiers could neither see nor fully understand. On the battlefields of Europe and North Africa, the Wehrmacht still possessed experienced officers, disciplined formations, and some of the most feared weapons of the war. Yet behind the front lines, another contest was unfolding, one measured not in captured cities, but in tons of steel, gallons of fuel, miles of railroad track, and the relentless output of factories. For years, Adolf Hitler's regime had promoted the image of Germany as an industrial giant capable of outproducing any opponent. Propaganda films celebrated new tanks, aircraft, and weapons while portraying the United States as a nation of luxury, divided by politics and lacking the determination for a prolonged conflict. Many German soldiers genuinely believed this narrative. Few had ever visited America, and wartime censorship ensured that most knew little about its true economic strength. The reality was very different. Even before entering the war in December 1941, the United States had begun transforming its economy into what President Franklin D. Roosevelt famously called the arsenal of democracy. Automobile companies that had once built family sedans redesigned their assembly lines to produce tanks and military trucks. Refrigerator manufacturers turned to aircraft components. Shipyards expanded at unprecedented speed. Steel mills increased production around the clock, while thousands of new factories rose across the country. Unlike Germany, whose industry increasingly struggled under Allied bombing and shortages of raw materials, the American mainland remained largely untouched by enemy attack. Its factories operated without the constant threat of air raids. Coal mines continued producing. Oil fields pumped millions of barrels of fuel. Railroads connected every major industrial region, allowing raw materials to flow continuously from mines and farms to assembly plants and ports. The numbers were staggering. By 1944, the United States was producing nearly half of all military equipment manufactured by the Allied powers. American factories built tens of thousands of aircraft every year, thousands of tanks, hundreds of thousands of trucks, millions of rifles, and vast quantities of ammunition. Equally important, they produced Liberty ships at astonishing speed, cargo vessels that carried troops, fuel, food, and equipment across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Some shipyards reduced construction times from months to just weeks. This industrial momentum was impossible to hide. German intelligence had estimated American production, but many of those estimates underestimated both the scale and the speed of U.S. manufacturing. At the front, German soldiers occasionally encountered the results directly. Destroyed American tanks were replaced with new ones. Downed aircraft seemed to reappear in ever greater numbers. Fresh trucks rolled toward the front almost as quickly as older ones were lost. Still, most soldiers never saw the source of this seemingly endless stream of equipment. That would change for thousands who became prisoners. The turning point began in North Africa. Following the defeat of Axis forces in Tunisia in May 1943, more than 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendered. It was one of the largest capitulations in German military history up to that point. Suddenly, the Allies faced a new challenge: where to house such an enormous number of prisoners while continuing military operations closer to the front. Britain already struggled with limited space and resources. Shipping prisoners to Canada helped, but the United States offered something no other Allied nation could match: vast territory, secure transportation networks, abundant food supplies, and enough room to build hundreds of prison camps far from active combat. Under the protections of the 1929 Geneva Convention, German prisoners transported to America were entitled to adequate food, shelter, medical care, and humane treatment. The U.S. Army generally adhered to these standards, not only out of legal obligation but also in the hope that American prisoners held by Germany would receive similar treatment. By the end of the war, approximately 371,000 German prisoners of war were held in the United States. They lived in more than 500 main camps and branch camps spread across nearly every state. Many camps were located in rural areas, where prisoners could be employed in agriculture to address labor shortages caused by millions of American men serving overseas. The journey to those camps became an education in itself. Escorted aboard troop trains, prisoners crossed thousands of miles of American landscape. Through train windows they saw mile after mile of farmland stretching beyond the horizon, busy freight yards filled with locomotives, bridges carrying endless traffic, and industrial cities whose factory skylines remained active day and night. Unlike much of wartime Europe, there were no bombed-out neighborhoods, no shattered rail stations, and no smoking ruins from recent air attacks. The country appeared to be functioning at full capacity while simultaneously supplying armies fighting on multiple continents. For many prisoners, this was the first crack in everything they had been told. And once they arrived at their camps, those cracks would only grow wider. For many German prisoners, life inside American POW camps did not begin with the brutality they had expected. Years of Nazi propaganda had portrayed the United States as both weak and vindictive, a nation incapable of fighting a disciplined war, yet certain to mistreat captured enemies. Instead, most prisoners encountered something far more surprising: an orderly system governed largely by the Geneva Convention. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, and escape was discouraged by the simple reality that thousands of miles of unfamiliar countryside lay beyond the fences. Prisoners received regular meals, medical care when needed, and opportunities to write letters home. While conditions varied from camp to camp, many German POWs later recalled that they had enough food to eat, an increasingly rare experience compared with civilians and soldiers in late-war Germany. But it was not the camps themselves that left the deepest impression. It was what lay beyond them. As labor shortages spread across the United States, many prisoners were assigned to work under military supervision. They harvested cotton in Texas, picked vegetables in California, cut timber in the Pacific Northwest, repaired roads, and worked on farms across the Midwest. American law generally prohibited POWs from working directly in weapons production, but countless prisoners supported the civilian economy that kept the war machine running. For many, this was their first close look at everyday American life. The farms seemed enormous. Instead of small plots worked by families and horses, they saw vast fields cultivated by tractors and combines capable of covering acres in a single day. Grain elevators towered over nearby towns. Long freight trains carried harvests across the country without interruption. Mechanization had transformed agriculture into an industrial enterprise of its own. German soldiers, many of whom had grown up in rural villages, were struck by the abundance. Food appeared plentiful. Livestock were healthy. Farm equipment was modern. Even with millions of Americans serving overseas, the countryside continued producing enough food not only for its own population but also for Allied armies around the world. The same pattern appeared wherever prisoners traveled. Railroads operated with astonishing efficiency. Freight trains stretched for what seemed like endless distances, carrying coal, steel, fuel, timber, vehicles, and manufactured goods between industrial centers. Locomotives arrived and departed with remarkable precision, connecting mines, factories, ports, and military bases into a single logistical network. To experienced German soldiers, logistics were not an abstract concept. They had lived through shortages. By 1944, German units increasingly struggled to obtain replacement vehicles, spare parts, fuel, and ammunition. Allied bombing campaigns had damaged rail junctions and factories throughout the Reich. Synthetic fuel plants became frequent targets. Deliveries slowed. Repairs took longer. Frontline units often waited weeks for equipment that never arrived. America presented the opposite picture. Everything appeared to move. Everything seemed connected. Everything seemed replaceable. Some prisoners later recalled seeing highways crowded with civilian automobiles even during wartime, a remarkable sight for men coming from a Europe where fuel rationing had become severe. Factories changed shifts around the clock. Freight yards remained active late into the night. Ports handled an endless flow of ships arriving and departing with military cargo. Perhaps the greatest shock came from the aircraft overhead. Training flights were common across much of the United States. Day after day, prisoners watched formations of bombers and fighters crossing the sky. Airfields that would have represented major military installations elsewhere appeared almost routine in America. New aircraft rolled off assembly lines while pilots trained in numbers that Germany could no longer match. The scale defied comparison. One factory alone could produce more aircraft in a year than entire nations had managed before the war. Even more astonishing was the speed. The American system emphasized standardization and mass production. Components were interchangeable. Assembly lines reduced manufacturing time dramatically. Damaged vehicles could often be repaired quickly because replacement parts were readily available. Entire Liberty ships were constructed in weeks rather than months. Trucks, tanks, and aircraft emerged from factories in numbers that seemed almost impossible. For prisoners who had served on the Eastern Front, in North Africa, or in Italy, these observations connected with memories from the battlefield. Now they understood why destroyed American tanks had been replaced so quickly. Why Allied aircraft always seemed to return. Why ammunition never appeared to run out. Why fresh trucks continued arriving despite heavy losses. The answer was not merely courage or superior tactics. It was production. It was logistics. It was an economy operating on a scale unlike anything the Axis powers could hope to equal. The realization did not come as a single dramatic moment. It grew gradually, reinforced by every passing train, every productive farm, every busy factory, and every aircraft overhead. For many German prisoners, the war was no longer simply a contest between armies. It had become a contest between economies. And in that contest, the outcome was beginning to look inevitable. The true turning point, however, came when many prisoners started comparing what they were witnessing in America with the increasingly desperate reports arriving from home, a contrast that made Germany's prospects appear darker than ever. By the summer of 1944, the contrast between Germany and the United States had become impossible for many German prisoners to ignore. News from Europe reached the camps through censored newspapers, Red Cross publications, and, in some cases, German-language camp newspapers supervised by American authorities. Prisoners learned of the Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Soviet Union's massive Operation Bagration later that month, and the relentless bombing campaign that continued to pound German cities and industrial centers. Every headline carried the same message. Germany was fighting on multiple fronts. America was still growing stronger. The difference became even clearer when prisoners considered what they had seen with their own eyes. During work assignments, train journeys, and daily life around the camps, they had witnessed a nation operating at extraordinary capacity. The factories never seemed to slow. Freight trains continued moving day and night. Harvests filled warehouses. Ports loaded ships without interruption. New military equipment rolled from assembly lines in quantities that defied imagination. For soldiers who had served on the front, these scenes suddenly explained countless mysteries. In North Africa, destroyed American trucks had quickly been replaced. In Italy, Allied artillery seemed to have an endless supply of ammunition. After Normandy, fresh American divisions continued arriving with new tanks, new aircraft, and new equipment while German commanders struggled to replace even experienced infantrymen. The battlefield now made sense. Behind every Sherman tank was a factory capable of building another. Behind every B-17 or B-24 bomber stood thousands of engineers, mechanics, machinists, and assembly line workers. Behind every Liberty ship was another already under construction. The American military did not simply replace losses. It often replaced them faster than they occurred. German industry, despite remarkable engineering achievements, operated under entirely different conditions. Strategic bombing had severely disrupted transportation networks. Oil shortages limited mobility. Steel and aluminum became increasingly scarce. Skilled workers were drafted into the military, while factories struggled with damaged infrastructure and interrupted supply chains. Even Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments, achieved impressive increases in production only under increasingly desperate circumstances. His reforms delayed collapse, but they could not overcome the overwhelming economic advantages enjoyed by the Allies, especially the United States. Many prisoners began discussing these realities among themselves. Historians have noted that attitudes inside American POW camps varied widely. Some prisoners remained fiercely loyal to the Nazi regime until the very end. Others quietly questioned the propaganda they had believed for years. A number of officers still insisted that Germany possessed secret weapons that would reverse the course of the war. But each passing month made those claims harder to believe. The evidence was all around them. One freight train passed. Then another. And another. Factories expanded instead of shrinking. American towns continued building schools, roads, and homes while simultaneously supplying millions of soldiers across two oceans. The sheer abundance challenged assumptions that had shaped German thinking since before the war. Many former prisoners later recalled that what impressed them most was not a single factory or military base. It was the scale. Everything seemed larger. The roads. The farms. The railroads. The warehouses. The ports. The distances between cities. Even ordinary civilian life reflected a level of economic capacity few had imagined possible. For soldiers accustomed to rationing and shortages, supermarket shelves, well-stocked farms, and uninterrupted transportation represented something almost as powerful as the tanks and aircraft they had faced in battle. The realization was psychological as much as military. Germany had entered the war expecting short campaigns that would secure quick victories before larger industrial powers could fully mobilize. Instead, it found itself locked in a prolonged conflict against nations whose combined production eventually dwarfed its own. By late 1944, American factories had produced nearly 100,000 aircraft in a single year, along with thousands of tanks, hundreds of thousands of military trucks, and enormous quantities of ammunition, fuel, and spare parts. Those numbers were not merely statistics. They represented an industrial rhythm that never stopped. Every destroyed vehicle could be replaced. Every damaged ship could be repaired or substituted. Every offensive could be supplied. For many German prisoners, this was the moment the final illusion disappeared. Victory was no longer a question of bravery. German soldiers had fought with determination on countless battlefields. Nor was it simply a matter of technology. Germany had developed some of the most advanced weapons of the war. The decisive factor was something less dramatic but far more powerful. An economy capable of sustaining total war for years without breaking. The prisoners had arrived believing they had been defeated by an army. Now many understood they had been defeated by an entire industrial civilization, one whose factories, railroads, farms, shipyards, and workers formed a logistical network unlike anything the world had ever seen. By the time Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, that realization was no longer confined to the camps. It had become one of the defining lessons of the war itself. Yet the story did not end when the fighting stopped. For thousands of former prisoners, the journey home would prove just as revealing, as they returned to a devastated Germany carrying memories of an America that had fundamentally changed their understanding of modern warfare and of the future. When Germany formally surrendered on May 8, 1945, the fighting in Europe came to an end, but for hundreds of thousands of German prisoners in the United States, captivity did not end overnight. Many remained in American camps for months while Allied governments organized transportation, reconstruction, and the massive task of returning millions of soldiers to their home countries. During that time, many prisoners continued working on farms, in forests, and on public works projects. Relationships that had begun with suspicion often became surprisingly respectful. Farmers who had once viewed the prisoners as enemies discovered that many were ordinary young men who had been swept into a devastating war. Some American families invited supervised prisoners to share meals after a day's work, while local communities gradually became accustomed to their presence. These experiences did not erase the horrors of the war or the crimes committed by Nazi Germany. Nor did every prisoner abandon the ideology they had once served. A number remained committed to National Socialism until the very end, and American authorities even separated particularly fanatical prisoners into special compounds after incidents of intimidation and violence against fellow captives. Yet for many others, captivity became an unexpected education. Away from the strict control of Nazi propaganda, they encountered a society that was far more complex than they had been taught to believe. They saw racial inequalities and political disagreements, but they also witnessed free elections, independent newspapers, thriving businesses, and an economy capable of supporting both civilian prosperity and an enormous military effort. Most importantly, they came to understand that America's greatest weapon had not been a single tank, bomber, or battleship. It had been its ability to organize millions of workers, thousands of factories, vast transportation networks, and seemingly limitless natural resources into one coordinated system. By the time many prisoners returned to Germany in 1946, they found cities reduced to rubble. Rail stations lay in ruins. Bridges had been destroyed. Industrial districts that had once powered the German war machine were silent. Food shortages remained severe, and millions struggled simply to survive the first post-war winter. The contrast with the America they had left behind could not have been sharper. Historians have since described the Second World War as a conflict won not only by battlefield tactics or technological innovation, but by logistics and industrial endurance. The United States produced more aircraft, ships, vehicles, fuel, food, and ammunition than any nation had ever assembled before. Combined with the contributions of Britain, the Soviet Union, and other Allied nations, this overwhelming economic strength gradually exhausted Germany's ability to continue fighting. For many former German prisoners, that lesson remained with them for the rest of their lives. Years later, some recalled that the most unforgettable memory was not the barbed wire surrounding their camps. It was the endless trains. The factories that never seemed to stop. The ports crowded with ships. The highways filled with trucks. The farms stretching beyond the horizon. Those ordinary sights revealed an extraordinary truth. Modern wars are not won solely by the courage of soldiers at the front. They are sustained by engineers designing machines, factory workers assembling equipment, farmers producing food, railroad crews moving supplies, dock workers loading ships, and millions of civilians whose labor never appears in battlefield photographs. The German prisoners who arrived in America expected to see only another enemy. Instead, many witnessed the industrial foundation of Allied victory. It was a realization that reached far beyond the prison camps. It demonstrated that in the 20th century, national strength was measured not only by the size of an army, but by the power of the society standing behind it. And perhaps that is the enduring lesson of this story. Battles can decide a campaign. Generals can shape a strategy. Weapons can change the course of a single engagement. But in a global war that spanned continents and consumed entire economies, the quiet rhythm of factory machines, freight trains, shipyards, and assembly lines proved just as decisive as the sound of guns on the battlefield. For thousands of German prisoners who crossed the Atlantic expecting to find a fragile opponent, that truth became impossible to ignore. By the time they returned home, many no longer believed they had simply lost to a stronger army. They believed they had witnessed the industrial power that helped determine the outcome of World War II itself.